I audible?
Yes, Priyan.
Okay, great. A very good evening to everyone and a very good morning to the AIS team from the US. I am Priyani Pranam and I will be MC for this event. On behalf of Wiespark School of Architecture and Vellore Institute of Technology, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome Colt Brock, Scott Cornelius, and Sarata Kitatsu from the American Institute of Architecture students and architect Deepika Vardarajan from Bangalore to Wiespark. I would like to extend my warm welcome to Dr. Jafar A. Khan, the director of our school, Dr. Michael Karasovich, Professor Dinesh Raghavan ES, and Professor Deepika M. I also welcome our student panelists Khadija Bukhari, Jabin Biju Thomas, Pratibha Padmanabhan, Costa Banerjee, Ariti Biju, all faculty members, students, and our audience for this evening to this panel discussion on studio culture policy, a need to enrich architecture teaching and learning processes in India. As we continue our distance education in a school of architecture, we realize daily the importance and value and conduct of design studios. The learning experiences in these spaces result in developing a distinct studio setting of their own, and the studio setting or studio culture, along with its values, greatly influence a student's learning process and education. The American Institute of Architecture students are pioneers in establishing studio culture policies across schools of architecture in the United States of America. This supports their vision of organizing and empowering student efforts for better architectural education, training, and practice. These studio culture policies are made for students by students, and I believe this panel discussion will be the platform where AIAS and VSpark come together to share insights and understanding about these policies that will benefit both students and faculty of architecture alike. I am optimistic that our panelists will have a constructive discussion and our audience will gain more acuity on the subject over the course of this webinar. I would also encourage our audience to please send in your questions in the chat box at any time during the webinar. Our moderators will take them up in the question answer session after the panel discussion. In closing, I am thankful to the entire AIAS BSpark Ad Hoc Committee for the diligent work for this event, and a special thanks to my colleague Vishruta Purushottama for her selfless support and assistance to the VSpark panelist team. I wish all the panelists a fruitful discussion. Thank you. Now, I would like to invite Nandana MT to please deliver the keynote address.
Good evening to one and all present here. Good morning as well. My name is Nandana, currently pursuing my final year of architecture degree, and I will be introducing the topic of discussion, studio culture. Studio culture is a topic that has been in discussion across the world constantly. It is an ever-changing presence in architectural education and profession, and it is important to talk about how greatly it impacts our lives, not only in the classroom or the office, but on a day-to-day basis. Architecture is a discipline which is technical, aesthetic, and social in scope. As such, it involves a broad range of intellectual and practical abilities. Perhaps the primary attribute of architectural thinking is the ability to synthesize information from a number of different disciplines. The unique architectural curriculum does not require students to attend traditional weekly classes. The studio becomes the central component, acting as an incubator for good design. It is a place where students learn by doing through research, test, development, and presenting design propositions. As the studio acts as a laboratory of new ideas, it is integral to weave a culture amongst its users in order to not only participate but also to initiate dialogues. How do we do this? Studio culture encompasses a number of distinct aspects of design teaching, such as class sessions and group meetings in which ideas and studio problems are discussed, individual discussions, which are perhaps the most characteristic component of design studio, reviews and critiques, which have varying degrees of formality, and finally, the private time spent working in studio, where projects are developed and produced. Each of these has a particular protocol and needs for it to be respected. Studio culture is not just restricted to design teaching, but also the studio atmosphere, which must encourage mutual respect among students, faculty, and administration. Studio culture can help develop an effective pedagogical approach through studio learning and can bring a great rigor in the design learning process as well as the depth of knowledge in the profession. It not just benefits the students, but the school as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you for that very succinct introduction to studio culture, Nandana. Next, I would like to invite Athira Suresh to please introduce the panelists for this webinar.
Thank you, Priyani. The AIAS panelists for today's discussion are Colt Brock. He is a third-year undergrad in the Bachelor of Science in Architecture at Georgia Tech. Originally from Dallas, Texas, Colt started his own AIAS chapter in 2016 as just a junior in high school, becoming one of about 20 high school chapters at the time. Since starting his own chapter, Colt has gone on to serve in various board positions at Georgia Tech, where most of his focus has been on advocacy and accessibility within the school and surrounding Atlanta community. Colt is currently serving as the 2020-2021 president of the AIAS chapter at Georgia Tech and chairs the Learning and Teaching Culture Advisory Group. Scott Cornelius is a fifth-year Bachelor of Architecture student at Oklahoma State University from Canyon, Texas. Having become involved with the AIAS in 2016 and with the rewriting of his own school studio culture policy in 2018, Scott's passion to cultivate and maintain a positive and healthy educational culture in schools of architecture has driven him to focus much of his involvement in the national AIAS and with the other architectural organizations on these issues. Scott is currently serving as the 2020-2021 South Quad Director of the AIAS and Board Liaison to the Learning and Teaching Culture Advisory Group, and in July will be inducted as the 2021-2022 National President. Sara Taketatsu graduated from the University of Colorado Boulder with a Bachelor of Environmental Design before serving as the 2019-2020 AIAS West Quad Director and the liaison to the Health and Wellness Task Force that was expanding the conversation of wellness in architecture schools. She currently serves as the 2020-2021 AIAS National Vice President and the Student Director of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture Board. Sara is passionate about building community and advocating for architecture students. From the School of Architecture VIT, the student panelists are Khadija Bukhari. She is a third-year Bachelor of Architecture student at the School of Architecture VIT. She grew up watching a city transform itself from a conventional concrete space to an architecturally vibrant urban landscape, which elicited her interest in architecture. The intrinsic relation between humans in the space have always intrigued her. Being a firm believer in making a space livable is just as important as creating a space for living. Khadija wishes to be identified by her own unique aesthetic that blends modernity and tradition in resonance with the simplistic elements of nature. While nurturing her passion for photography, she also experiments with culinary as a hobby. Jabin Biju Thomas is a fourth-year Bachelor of Architecture student at the School of Architecture VIT. As a cinema aficionado, he believes in creating narratives and perceiving his designs from a user's perspective, allowing him to explore different possibilities. His love for cinema and music have also helped him venture into various different art forms. Pratibha Padmanabhan is a final year Bachelor of Architecture student at the School of Architecture VIT. She believes architecture should be safe and sensitive to humanity and nature. She expresses her thoughts through writing, painting, and videography. She is a sensitive thinker who never gives up on anything which is the right thing to do. Kaustubh Banerjee is a final year Bachelor of Architecture student at the School of Architecture VIT. An avid lover of cinema and landscapes, both designed and natural, he strives to create architecture which merges them, allowing for multiple interpretations at different times. His innate passion for discovery and leadership inspires him to collaborate with various individuals while experiencing contrasting cultures. When not engaged in work, Kaustubh spends his time penning down his thoughts and unearthing alternative rock music from the past. Aarti Biju is a final year Bachelor of Architecture student at the School of Architecture VIT. With a notebook in her bag and an arsenal of questions in her mind, Aarti Biju has always had a keen interest in telling a story. Currently in her final year of architecture, she has always been a strong advocate of expression, be it through art, architecture, or words. The faculty panelists for this discussion are Dr. Jafar A. Khan, Director of the School of Architecture, VIT, India, and Dr. Michael Karasovich, Professor of Architecture, School of Architecture, VIT, India. And the moderators for today's discussion are Professor Deepika M., Professor of Architecture, School of Architecture, VIT, and architect Deepika Varadarajan, who is a practicing architect based in Bangalore, India. A warm welcome to everyone.
Thank you very much, Adhira. With this, I would like to invite Colt, Scott, and Sarah to please go ahead and share their presentation on the learning and teaching culture policy of the AIAS.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was such a lovely introduction, and I am honored to be presenting along such amazing fellow students and faculty and advocates for students. So Colt is going to be sharing the screen. And thank you, Colt. My personal computer doesn't it doesn't allow me to do this. So very, very thankful for us to have this ability to be with you all today as we get this presentation going. And then again, I know there's the opportunity for questions. So I hope this brings up the ability to have questions for us. We're really excited to talk about this topic and be representatives on the US side of where this conversation has gone. So we'll go to the next slide. And you already know who we are, but just a reminder, this is what our faces look like. We're very pleased to be here today, of course, and we'll go one by one just to say hi again. Hi, everyone. My name's Sarah. I am the current vice president and have had the opportunity to talk about this topic in a lot of different arenas, especially with ACSA and working with schools and students, especially on the health and wellness side. Colt, do you want to go next?
My name is Colt Brock. Started this conversation a bit later than Scott and Sarah, but it's been an honor to chair the committee this year and really push these conversations forward in a more formal manner.
And I'm Scott Cornelius. I started this conversation, I guess, in about 2018, just when I started working on the learning and teaching culture policy for Oklahoma State University. And then that led me into more national conversations. How are we, pushing these policies on a national scale to schools all over the country? And that's kind of led me to my position currently in AIS. So very excited to be starting to push this agenda and these thoughts internationally and get the word out there.
And that'll be especially easier to do as the incoming national president for next year. So keep an eye on this one. Keep an eye on both of these guys, absolutely, as I'm on my way out. So we want to give you a little bit of an introduction into what our experience with learning and teaching culture is. And so we'll go to the next slide. And this is what it is. I won't read this to you. But handing it off, I think, to Colt to give more context.
With the fantastic presentation on studio culture. And I just want to add on, in the last couple of years, we've really, as an organization, branched out what we define studio culture as into learning and teaching culture. We feel that the education of an architect, while very, very focused with studio, encompasses so many other aspects of our lives and our education. And so in addition to everything that was mentioned earlier, we've really wanted to push this conversation across the entire school to inhabit the overall health and mental and physical health of our students. And so it's been super excited to sort of expand this culture beyond just the four walls, if you will, of studio and really push to make this across architecture school, across all of our professors, whether in a studio or otherwise. But yeah, like all things said earlier, it's really just to support faculty and students into a more positive environment to sort of facilitate and encourage education and creativity.
So, I mean, based on the introduction that you all gave on studio culture, I think that the understanding of why it's important is already there. And I think we all understand pretty well that we're just trying to maintain healthy habits and a good lifestyle within architectural education and design education, because for decades it's been very unhealthy, and it's been essentially a toxic workplace to be in a studio. So we're trying to combat that now. So these conversations and these issues have been around for decades and decades, but the real effort on this part started in the late 1990s. Some very specific events surrounding students maintaining an unhealthy culture, and then actually there was a few students that stayed up, for a couple of nights to finish a project, and then went on a drive for their break and got in a car crash and died. And so that really sparked this conversation on a national level, and made people think this is a really unhealthy thing we're doing. We need to combat this right now. So in 2000, the AIS started getting into the conversation about studio culture and thinking, how can we as students combat this and make sure that we're living healthier lives? Because it's not just the faculty's responsibility or the administration's responsibility, it's our responsibility too. So over the past 2 decades, I mean, I won't dive into just all the studies that have been published and things, but the work has been increasing and increasing year after year. Some important things to note is in 2004, the AIS successfully lobbied the National Architectural Accreditation Board in the US to establish a studio culture policy as a requirement for being accredited as a school of architecture. So unless you have this policy that says how you want to be healthy, you can't actually have students that are graduating with a professional degree and they can't become architects. So that was a really, really important step in the life of studio culture. But over the past few years, the past 3 years specifically, these questions have come back up of how are we enforcing this healthy culture? How are we maintaining good relationships between students and faculty? Are we doing enough? And we started looking at the name of studio culture itself, and we discovered that it was pretty limited. We're talking about just the culture within studios. What about the rest of architectural education and the rest of design education? There's also spaces where we learn in classrooms that are not in studios, and there's spaces where we learn outside of school completely. Social education is also a very important part of this. So we actually changed the name of studio culture to learning and teaching culture to better encompass all of architectural education, all of architecture school. So that's why there's been kind of this difference of some people are saying studio culture, some people saying learning and teaching culture, because that just changed very recently, but we think it's very important to note. And so that's the general history over the past few years of studio culture. And obviously we'll be going over the Learning and Teaching Culture Policy Project, which was created last year by a team of AIS students and also representatives of different architectural organizations in the US, just coming together to think, all these schools have very disjointed policies and they're kind of all over the place, and we don't have a set baseline for what these policies should look like, how strong they should be, how thorough they should be. So the Model Learning and Teaching Culture Policy, which is within the Learning and Teaching Culture Policy Project, which is a mouthful, by the way, is created just to show these students, here's the model, here's the baseline of what these policies should be and how much they should help you. Now build from there, add your own school's culture and your uniqueness to it. So it's not meant to be prescriptive, it's just meant to be something that's helpful and something for them to start off from. So Colt will get into the very recent history of what we've been working on, but that's generally over the past 20 years what the AIS has been working on in terms of studio culture and learning and teaching culture.
I was supposed to advance one for you. Sorry about that. But yeah, recently, like Scott has said, being very humble, Scott was a big component of that team. Our current past president and Scott, who's here with us today, spent a large part of the end of 2019 going into 2020 before the pandemic started, working on this policy project and the implementation and sort of the creation of the model learning and teaching culture policy. Lots of acronyms, lots of words. Sorry about that, but yeah, Scott and Sarah Curry spent a large time on this, and as we transitioned our new board in this past summer, the creation of the committee that Scott and I lead, the Learning and Teaching Culture Advisory Group, was started, and so this year we've been focusing a lot on mental and physical health, sort of evaluation of the model document, documents and policies from schools across the country. And we've also been generating a lot of content around mental health and trying to push for advocacy and transparency throughout documents in schools, sort of a grassroots effort by students. But yeah, let's see. I don't know what our next slide is. We'll go ahead and move into the core values. Scott, I don't know if I'm starting or if you are on these.
Yeah, if you want to start off and do maybe the first 4, then I'll take the rest of them if that's good with you.
So outlined in that policy project and inside of the model document, Scott and Sarah, the representatives from the other organizations and students as well, identified these sort of 9 core values. Obviously, these are very much a baseline. And as a committee, we are working this year to go through and reevaluate, add in, revise, reword things. But at the time, the 9 values that we really find to be within these documents and within these schools. The first one being optimism, as mentioned, and as we all know, design school is intended to be a creative space, and without a positive thinking and positive striving environment, it's really hard to create good design and design that is healthy. The second one being professional conduct. Professionalism is important. While some architecture schools pride themselves in being casual and having casual relationships between professor and student, the professional conduct between that sort of student staff, student faculty relationship is really important and critical to design development, and sort of the respect for our faculty and their respect for us. A key part of architectural education also, as we all know, is the idea of the critique, the review, and when we receive that feedback, making sure that all feedback, whether it be from a member of the university, another student, guest critics, guest reviewers, whoever it may be, that all of it is constructive. We really aren't seeking to sort of just like blanket, make everything sunshine and rainbows, but we really want positive and constructive feedback to come from all interactions between staff and student. Nothing should be putting students down or devaluing the student or the time they put into their work. And then the last one being a collaborative community. I know we probably missed that quite a bit with virtual schooling, but encouraging and trying to create within studio spaces and learning spaces a collaborative space for students to design together and think together, whether it be a team project or solo project, but encouraging sort of that horizontal interaction between students as we all strive to complete our education and really just bring positive change to the world. Yeah, Scott, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, so next is health and well-being, which obviously health and well-being is maybe the reason that these policies started in the first place. So this is a very important part of learning and teaching culture. But it's just ensuring health on a variety of levels. So that includes physical health, obviously. We want to be making sure that students are sleeping and eating and doing all those healthy things to continue living in a healthy way. But also mental health is very important and increasingly important. Opening those conversations up, making sure that students aren't overworking themselves, stressing themselves out, getting burnt out during their time in architecture school is something you have to intentionally do, that it can't just happen on its own. And then other things like financial health are also things that go into learning and teaching culture policies. So architecture school is a very expensive endeavor, and we want to make sure as students that we're representing those students who may not have access to all the financial resources that other students might. Buying models, buying softwares, buying all these different things for architecture school might be necessary, but we can minimize that cost as much as possible just to make sure that everyone's getting a quality education at a small price, hopefully. Time management and school life work balance fits pretty well into health and well-being, just because we want to make sure that students are, again, not overworking themselves and that they have the resources to know how to not overwork themselves. So you don't come into architecture school knowing how to manage your time well. That's just not something that happens. So you have to be taught that. You have to be given tips for that, be taught kind of this new way of life surrounding design. And then school life work balance, you'll notice that there's 3 aspects to that, because a lot of students work while they're in school and they have life going on outside of both of those things. So maintaining that balance is very important, not only on an individual level, but on an institutional level. Diversity and solidarity obviously has become very, very important over the past year, especially within the US. Just making sure that we're being very diverse and equitable in the way that we teach students, in the way that we give information, in the way that we teach about architectural history. This has become increasingly important. And maintaining that solidarity just within our individual interactions in schools of architecture as well, again, as on the institutional level. Respectful stewardship and space management might be one of the lighter aspects of learning and teaching culture policies, but it's still very important to make sure that we're respecting the spaces that we use for architecture school. And that might seem a little moot during virtual times, but you also have to respect the Zoom call. You have to not be interrupting and doing all these crazy things on Zoom when your professors are teaching, and just being respectful in that way and maintaining your spaces makes us all stay healthy too. So that fits into health and well-being as well. And finally, well-rounded enrichment. We don't just want to attend studio, and that's what architecture school is all about. There's so many other aspects to architecture school. You have to learn history. You have to learn about how to keep people healthy, how to fit mental health into design. You should also go out and learn things that might be completely unrelated to architecture. You should learn some good business practices. Maybe you should take a dance course. Maybe that will inspire you to design better. But just some way to maintain that well-rounded enrichment and become well-rounded citizens and students instead of just a good architect or a good designer is very important and fits very well into learning and teaching culture policies. So these are the 9 values that we identified for the model learning and teaching culture policy, which again is to say they're not prescriptive, and this isn't all that goes into these policies, and that should be expanded or reduced or changed depending on the individual culture of each school. But these are the basic things that we wanted to identify to say, these are the 9 things we think should be included in every policy in some way and are very important on a baseline at a minimal level for what we're trying to accomplish here.
Yeah, and I'll jump in really briefly here as we move forward with some of the practical pieces of this. This model document, as well as the whole project that was completed this past year, a fundamental goal of this was to create a living document, something that people and schools can build consensus around. There has been a practice in the United States where these studio culture policies are a requirement in the schools. However, they get pinned to the wall, maybe alluded to very briefly at the beginning of the year, and then they live on the wall and no one looks at them and no one adheres to them year after year. So as we'll talk about revisiting your policy, part of the goal of the project was to create a set of resources that students as well as instructors and admin could use to create a living document that would actually be part of the fabric of a school. So that's where a lot of the challenge around these policies lives, is that as many of you have experienced it, obviously policies are around us all the time, but what makes them relevant is talking about them, bringing them up as a forefront of conversation, which clearly is happening here. It's the topic of discussion today, but making sure that these these conversations keep happening throughout the year. So while the model document and the packet are a fantastic starting point, we have done some of the legwork, but so much more of the legwork is on the school instituting the policy. And so these core values and these elements of the packet that was produced are a starting point, knowing that you have a lot more work to do. So with that, I'll pass it back off.
Yeah, and Scott, I think you'll be jumping into these tips for
Yes.
conversation.
Absolutely. So this is about the final part of our presentation, and we just wanted to talk about what's actually difficult about learning and teaching culture policies, because up to now we've been kind of talking about how to write a good learning and teaching culture policy, and believe it or not, that's the easy part. Just writing this policy and putting it in place, and you feel really, really great about it when you're finished. But that's not the hard part of this, and just writing the policy itself is pretty meaningless unless you have conversations about it and you keep discussing it, like Sarah said, and revisiting it over and over. So when you're having those conversations, some difficult conversations might start, and just giving tips on how to go through those is something we wanted to focus on. So there's a larger one-pager about this within the LTCPP packet, but I'll just go over some of these really quickly. So also before I go into this, I wanted to clarify that learning and teaching culture policies is not meant to be a war between any factions within architecture school. It's not meant to be a way to battle faculty or to battle students or to battle administration. It's just a route to an agreement with all three of them that works for everyone and is healthy for everyone. But given that, you still might come across some difficult conversations and some people that aren't so open to these ideas. So you might get someone who says there's no time to talk about learning and teaching culture policies right now. We have too much going on. And that's especially true right now during the pandemic. Who wants to talk about like culture policies when there's a pandemic going on globally? But what I would tell them is it's even more important right now than ever because we don't know what's happening. Nobody's sure of what's going on within the school. We need to establish a cultural base at the very first level, and then you can build off of that, and then you can build a good curriculum, good teaching practices, things like that. But if you don't have that cultural base and an agreement between all the factions within your school, then everything will devolve and there will be nothing to lean back on and nothing to say, are we doing this right? Are we interacting correctly? So it's very important at any time, but especially in times of turmoil. So we're already doing these things. Why do we need this document? That might be something that's said. First of all, I would say you're not already doing all these things. There's no school in the entire world that's already doing all these things effectively. But why do we need this document? What if you stop doing these things? What if we forget how to do these things? Then we'll have no way to go back to the way we were doing them. We'll have no way to get back to that positivity. But if you have this document, then when something starts devolving, when things start falling apart, you can say, hey, this document that we all agreed on says this right here. So we need to move back the direction we came from, or else we need to change and go this other way. So it's just a way to keep everyone accountable. And again, the policy itself has no power, but it's just a way to keep each other accountable and start these conversations over and over. This is too much to ask of faculty. I hope we can all agree that that's a terrible excuse and that we don't want to come across that, but it might come up. And faculty and students and administration all have a responsibility to the culture of the school, and they may need to be reminded of that. But at the very basis, if you agree to be a part of this university education, you have to agree to maintain a positive culture and to work toward education for everyone. So they do have a responsibility, and it's not too much to ask. It's never too much to ask. This isn't in compliance with university policies. Again, these policies, the learning and teaching culture policy, have no power, and they need to be in compliance with the university policies. But if you come across a university policy that's directly working against a positive culture, that's a different conversation that you need to have with administration and with someone who can change those policies. So again, while these policies can't be in direct, combat with other policies that are already in place, if there's something that's negative going on, you need to work to change that. And these learning and teaching culture policies can help to define and identify those negative practices that are already in place. Students don't feel like there's an issue with studio culture at the school right now. That's probably just not true. And if that you come across that argument, send out some surveys, get the real answer on that, do some research. This doesn't have to just be a conversation between leaders of a school and faculty. It can be the entire student body coming together to work toward a positive goal. So start talking to students around you and asking them, what do you see that's wrong with our culture at the school? And you'll get a lot of students that are like, oh, I don't want to do my homework. And that's like not legitimate and not something that you should put into this policy. But you'll come across a lot of students that have legitimate concerns that should be addressed immediately. So just start having those conversations again. And we don't have the capacity to police this. Is a big conversation, and just how to enforce these policies is a big conversation. But there's a lot of different solutions to that, and we outline a few of them in the Learning and Teaching Culture Policy Project. But forming a committee of students to help police this is a big solution we've been coming across. Some committee that's advised by faculty, so they are legitimate and they have all those different perspectives, but the students can do the legwork that the faculty can't, because it's a student effort essentially, because you're creating this policy for yourselves and you're moving into the workforce with this positivity coming from these policies. So if faculty say they can't have time to police this, offer to help police it yourself as a leader of the school. So it's kind of a give and take, a constant conversation. And again, it's not a war. It's a moving forward together. And so that's our general tips on how to have tough conversations. But once again, I sent the link in the chat. You can check out the full packet, and there's more detailed tips in there on all kinds of things. So definitely check that out. But I think that's about the end of the presentation.
with maybe a
Yeah.
plug for how everyone can get in contact with the advisory group if they had specific questions.
Yeah, you can reach out to us through our email, ltc@aias.org. I don't know if somebody wants to drop that in the chat for me. That would be great. But yeah, if you have any questions or want to get in contact with Scott or myself or anyone from our committee, we'd love to be in touch with you if you have any questions. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much for that very enriching presentation on AIAS's work. I really think that the point you made about studio culture expanding into the learning and teaching policy is quite critical, given the nature of how our education is and how we work as an architecture school. And thank you for all the links and your email ID. I'm sure we'll be getting in touch with you soon. With this, I would also like to now invite our VSpark panelists to share their presentation on fostering studio culture and how a studio culture policy can enrich architectural education at VSpark. Over to you.
Hi, good evening, everybody, and also a very good morning to Sarah, Scott, and Colt. Thank you for being here and thank you for your presentation. I think uh, takeaways from what you shared with us today and also a discussion based on what we really talk about would go a long way in the formation of our studio culture policy as well, and really trying to contextualize the entire conversation to the Indian subcontinent and not just our school. With that, let me start sharing my screen. And yeah, I'm going to ask that question where is everybody able to see my screen? Can everybody hear me properly? Yeah, sounds good. All right. Okay, so the process of doing or just working on this presentation has just been rigorous discussion over the course of the past 3 weeks with my co-panelists today, who are Aarti, Pratibha, Jabin, Khadija, and also with the special contribution of Vishruta, who we are very grateful for. And she's really been an advisor for the whole process. Uh, Now, these discussions have not just been limited to students, but we've also tried to bring in some representation from faculty. We've had discussions with our director. We've had discussions with our acting design chair, as well as with students from the ad hoc committee that we've appointed towards the learning and teaching culture policy, or the studio culture policy as we've been calling it so far. Um, and for the course of this presentation, we've really tried to share our personal experiences that we've had over the course of 5 years or 4 years or 3 years, depending on which batch of the student does the student belong to, who's talking right now. So it's really a representation of through different years what have been our experiences and how have we had our journey in this school. So this uh, these are a this is a small timeline of our journey, right? So we did not start in a school which was designed to function as an architecture studio. We started off in the library building in our institution, which I show over here towards the left of your screen. And we were really in a hall which did not have much, so it was completely up to our understanding. It was completely open for our interpretation and the way we want to use that studio. While that was happening, the construction of a new architecture school, which was designed for all these activities, was also happening simultaneously. And we saw the course of the construction of that building from scratch. So we saw how studios work in an environment which is not designed for that, all the way to how they're supposed to work, or how a space designed for that particular activity could happen. As a concept, studio culture, or learning and teaching culture, has been very new, not just to our school, but for the entire Indian subcontinent. But in principle, I think it has been there in our school in some way or the other. Now, as an institution, we try to do these quality control meetings every couple of months or every 2 or 3 months, as and when time permits. And what happens is, in our department, which is a relatively young department of just 5 or 6 years old, uh, there's no tall order, right? Everybody is very accessible. We can just go up to our directors or our acting design chair whenever we need to approach them for a problem, and more often than not, they are addressed and we get the help that we require. But then this should really get enforced, and if there could be a document which really supports our interests, then that would really go a long way in furthering the entire conversation and be towards the betterment of the entire school. Now, my co-panelists today have really been VSpark students from different batches that we tried to bring together to get different set of experiences and different type of conversations across. And all of them has really seen this evolution of the school over the years and the transition of the school and the students between these three buildings, and also them learning from the school during its construction. With that, I invite Pratibha to give us some context about how the school has really evolved.
Yeah. So, VSpark School of Architecture started in 2015. It is one of the various schools in the VIP campus. So, VSpark has evolved and adapted through different studio circumstances, location, and environment. And we started our architectural education in the fourth, fifth, and sixth floors of the existing library building. And our initial exposure to architecture studio was in the long halls with views of seamless nature, mobile furniture, and coexistence of studio and theory classes under one roof without partitions. And also, we were constantly engaging with hands-on outdoor workshops utilizing the yards nearby, so which fetched visitors from various departments, and it often sparked conversation about the different activities we were engaging on. So from this, we moved into the new block, which was built for the School of Architecture, which itself stands as a role model and inspiration for students. So the studio here is designed in two different levels with views within the building, and the building as a whole is more introverted, and the large central arena keeps enabling interaction with students of different classes and courses. Arts and hands-on activities here were accommodated in the designated classroom for arts and crafts, contrary to the construction yard in the previous East Park Library building. So comparing the buildings, we kind of moved from learning and searching outside the studio towards the inside. That we ended up learning from the studio and the building itself. Yeah.
So I think it's already been established, that academically architecture in itself is pedagogy, and our architecture schools and studios influence us and our design processes. So our schools and studios are the places where we're introduced to the world of design, and they shape our thoughts, our thought processes, and design practices. So it's like every building has its very own embedded hidden curriculum.
Now, these were a set of questions that we kept asking ourselves over the course of the past 3 or 2 weeks since we've been discussing. And then once we ask a question, we try to go into our set of experiences to try to answer them or try to at least talk about them. So the first question that we really start talking about is, how does one really ensure student participation and extension of life that's just not limited to the four walls of the studio, like our co-panelists from AIAS also referred to.
So over the years, we noticed that students tend to indulge more in academic work when they're comfortable with their peer groups and faculties. So so developing certain social skills is very important to become an architect, because we need to be eloquent while expressing our thoughts and ideas. Design studios need to become a stepping stone in this direction and enable the students to express their designs and thoughts evocatively. All ideas and thoughts must be given a platform, because this is where student interactions and discussions will play a vital role. And there also needs to be a shift from the polarized environment with a clear hierarchy between teachers and students, helping the students communicate better and grow in the process. So this was an image clicked in last school Oroville. I think Scott also mentioned about the spaces and the environment we design in. So this was in last school Oroville, where we visited for a case study in 2019. So here you can see how the studios are designed, and every student has a very own customized environment. This is to suit their own needs, and this is an important factor because we as architects spend hours in our studios. So we need to ensure that we are in an environment that is comfortable and helps us in the process of designing. In a way, how we utilize our areas and work with them defines our identity.
Learning in architecture is never restricted to what is taught in class. Students are constantly learning or observing from their surroundings or their interactions with one another. Such a learning beyond studio can actually be accentuated by the introduction of breakout or spill out spaces within architecture schools. Such spaces not only act as hubs for students to unwind and relax, but they also create an environment for interaction amongst batches and stimulates a different idea of learning from one another.
The second set of questions that we wanted to talk about was also about allowing for a flexible studio brief and also creating opportunities for exploration in the entire design process that the school and the institution is really built around.
Design is a creative entity that is approached in a different manner by every student. Students design with distinctive processes that cater to their comfort and understanding. Their designs are established from a definite world of thought that require time for articulation. Quite often, students tend to get restricted by the rigidity of schedules that focus more on the final product rather than the process. This also tends to change the mindset a student has towards their design. A certain level of flexibility in studio structure allows for encouragement as well as accommodation of the different ways of approach, as well as the pace of students during different stages of design. Such flexibility should allow for provision to adapt and interpret the design brief such that it aids the design process rather than restricts it.
So it is important that we are also given this freedom to explore in terms of styles, materials, and techniques at an initial stage, because these skills will help us shape our identities as an architect or a designer. And studios must provide opportunities for exploration so that the students get to venture into unique and distinctive ways of representing their thoughts and designs. So we spend a lot of time in workshop acquiring new skills, but we don't really use them once the workshops are done. We could start incorporating these techniques and modes of presentation into our designs. Studios also need to allow this sense of freedom and depart from producing homogeneous work across students.
Now, we also wanted to know how could interaction really be enforced and how could that really start happening naturally and organically in studios? And the idea of a crit not being like a roadblock or a checkpost that you have to cross, but how could a crit start becoming a part of the design development process?
So the studios become our second homes the day we join architecture school. It is where we think, we create, we build, innovate, and also relax. So when a space holds so much importance to its users, it is important that it also creates an environment that's um, that's peaceful, that's calm, that's welcoming, and also an environment that encourages interactions between students, be it casual, informal, or formal. So when after having worked in studios of two different kinds, we realize how these spaces impact our work and our work environment. So we to bring in a positive work environment, studios could have spacious work spaces where students can comfortably accommodate themselves or even sit in maybe groups of 2 to 3 students and have interaction with each other. The furniture could be barrier free, allowing a continuous line of sight throughout the studio and creating a sense of openness. It should encourage casual interactions between students or even the exchange of simple gestures like smiles or waves across the studio, creating a friendly environment. Um, there could be little corners of the studio that are dedicated to interior landscapes that the students could customize and increase their sense of belonging to the space. The more simple and customizable the space is, the more students are allowed to interpret how they see the space, the more effective the studio environment would be.
In an architecture school, discussion between student and faculty happens during the design process. And most of the students across all architecture schools would have faced this difficulty to discuss with a particular faculty, hearing about the discouraging criticism and judgments. So faculty should try to understand and realize that students are from diverse social contexts and should be flexible and open-minded. Understanding this and viewing the unique creative process of each student in their perspective will help a lot. And also, critic reviews are a very important part of learning, and criticism across all architecture schools sometimes end up lowering self-confidence of a student, resulting in the student losing interest in the subject, or it sometimes even blocks the creative process. And subjective feedbacks could become very personal, and if the criticism can become more objective. Like if a student receives feedback in a structural, plumbing, or design necessary basics, which will improve the knowledge and learning of a student instead of criticizing the creativity. And criticism should be framed in a very constructive manner, and the faculty should be sensitive towards the mental health of the student.
So a studio is bound to have students of varying calibers in various different aspects. So through a design process, if the faculty finds or observes a student to be ahead of the rest, or is observed to have a skill that is unique to the person, the student could be encouraged to demonstrate or share the skill with the rest of the class. This would not only encourage the student to gain deeper or research more about their skill and work more on it, and or to speak in front of a crowd, but would also encourage the other students to work more on themselves. This brings a transparency and healthy competitive spirit within the studio. This practice would also bring up the studio average, not because of one or two students, but because of the entire class as a whole.
Now, the most paramount question out of this entire debate has really been, how does studio culture policies, or how does studio culture in itself bridge that gap between academia, practice, as well as the quality of life? So, while we were discussing, we also noticed that there was another scope for improvement in the larger scheme of things at the institution level as well. Now, our institute really divides subjects into two broad categories called core subjects and elective subjects. And the necessity to do that is so that there is effective credit distribution, and each student really finishes their courses and their credits and graduate on time. Now, because that happens, there's also an impression that some of these elective subjects are really optional, which they are not. Now, for example, the subjects like principles of structures, or quantity surveying, or estimation and specification, these are essential and very, very integral to the education of an architect and for them to practice in the profession tomorrow. But the minute they're moved into the elective sort of basket of subjects, there's this inherent thing that maybe they're not as important as the other subjects, such as design studio in itself. Um, Now, as a department, we are not really strangers to integrating both the things. We're not strangers to integrating theory and application. And like you can see in the images that I've shown here, we've really worked with brick arches, and we've really worked on how does one construct a brick from earth blocks, and how does one work with fractals, how does one work with bamboo, the joinery details of bamboo. So we've really worked on integrating structures, but then just like Jabin pointed out, they do not cross this threshold of that 3 or 4 day workshop, right? So the minute that starts to happen, that gap gets filled, these subjects start working in unity. And when that happens, it calls for a more holistic development of not just students, but their work throughout different batches as well. So once one implements this as a policy, and really thinks of it as something that's going to happen in the school, you do not have situations where you're walking up to a civil engineering faculty and asking for help regarding integrating structural design towards your architectural concepts. Because more often than not, when those situations arise, you just get pointed towards a bunch of code books and you don't really get the answers that you want. So maybe a way to integrate application with the theory that you learn would help. Another idea that we kept discussing and kept going back on was the thoughts of vertical studios. Now, these are just really good methods of ensuring interaction across batches, and like Khadija mentioned before, they also ensure that there's skill sharing and knowledge sharing, not just within one cohort, but also within different cohorts, and different years of experience get sort of shared together. The images shown here are from a similar exercise that we did in the school back in 2016. And we really came across with another university where three different cohorts, two of our own and one from their side, came together and designed and built a bamboo fractal pavilion from scratch. So that was back when I was still in the first grade, and I just keep going back to that entire process and keep thinking about that all the time, because that really served as the introduction to design process for us younger students back in the day. And for the senior most students from their batches, we realized that it became like a refresher course to simpler things in architecture.
Now, it's not an unknown fact that architecture is quite an intensive course with a heavy workload. And the copious amount of work required by the course causes students to sacrifice some of the basic vital necessities and in turn develop unhealthy habits. I don't think I have to elaborate much on the sleepless nights we've endured or the meals we've skipped for work because we've all experienced it at one point or the other. Now, in addition to this, students also endure a lot of stress throughout the course as its rigorous nature can be quite overwhelming. All this tends to take a physical as well as mental hit on the well-being of a student. Now, such a lifestyle might have been normalized in architecture, but it's high time we break it down at an educational level. Otherwise, it tends to steep into the different stages of our profession. For example, the lifestyle that we subject ourselves to during our architectural education gets carried on to when we work in a professional field. And then further, when we decide to establish a firm ourselves, we expect such a behavior from our employees as well. It forms a loop where there's no balance between life as well as work. Now, moreover, other than the lack of normalization of such a lifestyle, the lack of time management has also caused students to focus solely on architecture and miss out on great opportunities. When talking with respect to our college itself, VIT has a large number of clubs and chapters that cater to different spheres of interest and they're active throughout the year. However, there's a gap that exists between architecture students and said clubs and chapters, as they feel like they might not be able to manage both due to the intensive nature of the course. Now, while this feeling is justified, being part of clubs and chapters provides us with qualities that contribute to character development on a large scale, and they're an integral part of our student life. Hence, to combat all these issues, it is very important to encourage and exemplify time management at early stages of architectural education, as it allows students to prioritize their education without compromising on their health or their quality of life.
Now, in closing, I'd like to really introduce those themes again that we discussed through the course of this presentation. And unwittingly, they've been the same sort of broad headings that AIA's team has also discussed with us here today. The thought of discussion versus competition in studio, the thought of encouraging variety in design studio today by incorporating these workshops into academia would lead to a lot of variety in the profession tomorrow as well. And we keep complaining about lack of variety in architecture, lack of a sense of identity in the work that we see in the world tomorrow. That's partly because we don't have variety in the studio today, right? So these things, once they start getting incorporated at the policy level, perhaps could start helping the entire profession as well tomorrow. With that, I'd like to thank our organizers and our audience, and that's the end of our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very comprehensive presentation about BSpark. Most of the audience is from the school, so they probably relate to almost all the points that you have brought across. And I'm sure that our audience has a bunch of inquisitive thoughts and lots of questions for our panelists after these two presentations. So now I would like to invite our moderators of the event to please take over. Over to you, Professor Deepika and Architect Deepika.
Thank you so much, Priyani. Both the presentations were wonderful and they were very thought-provoking, in fact. And I would just like to give my appreciations to both other teams who presented today. And yeah, we are on this discussion on studio culture policy, a need to enrich architecture teaching and learning, the process in India. So I would like to just begin the discussion with the initial slides that were presented by the AIS team, where they spoke about time management and school work-life balance as one of the core values. And also on an equivalence, Aarti also mentioned the same by the end of the presentation. So I would just request AIS team to dig a bit deeper into that, to throw some light on how to bring this balance of work and life, which is very important, and that will really impact the working pattern of the architecture student itself. So please.
Yes, I'll jump in first because that is such a great question to start out on and so fundamental to our experience as students and instructors. And I think having been graduated for a few years now and thinking more holistically about the process, what was said about the cycle of what we experience in school becoming what we experience in practice has one more step, and that is that those who practice architecture start teaching architecture. And so that piece is really important to think about. And we're really struggling with this in the United States right now and trying to find ways to better the ability of our instructors to teach architecture in a more balanced way as well. So our instructors are the ones who are also expecting, maybe implicitly and maybe not recognizing it in themselves, that their expectations of students are the expectation of how they experienced being a student. And so even if they haven't recognized this in themselves, it is about having a holistic conversation with all the stakeholders present to talk about finding values, shared values, and how to reinvent how we teach, how we learn. And I think that's, an important piece of learning and teaching culture. It's not just a list of demands from students and instructors feeling targeted. It is also a way for instructors to really lean into this idea that we say architecture is a practice. Architecture is a practice because you have to continually learn, you have to continually push the boundary of what is possible. And that's also the case for instructors. And so that is a critical piece of the question. Of course, it is also on students to learn time management. But what if our instructors had training themselves on how to teach time management? An instructor can say, have better time management, but has the instructor really gone into educational theory about how best to teach this and how best to implement this in the classroom, which is a broad and very challenging kind of a thing to face, but it is important. And I'll stop there because now I'm going off on a tangent.
No, that's
but
okay.
Anyone else from the AIS team briefly? Sorry, I took the time on that one.
No, I think that was wonderful. I'll just kind of plus one to what you said and add kind of a personal example. So we've been talking in our School of Architecture about the ability to, have this time balance between school and life and work, and who can teach us that, who can give us these tips. And you can look around our School of Architecture, and all of our School of Architecture faculty are practicing architects, or at least at one point they are practicing architects. And so many of them are staying in their offices or staying in the studio until 4 a.m. And you see them doing that and you think, this person can't teach me how to maintain a healthy balance within my life, because they don't currently have a healthy balance within their life. So just like what Sarah said, it's starting at the faculty level. It has to start with instructors. And these policies should be a teaching experience for instructors just as much as for students. And instructors should grow from these policies just as much as students should. And then kind of bouncing off that, you just need to find the individuals who have kind of discovered that balance and who are working toward that, and use them to mentor younger students. So if that's instructors, that's fantastic. If it's older students that need to mentor younger students on how to maintain their life, that's fantastic as well, because in many situations, these younger students will listen to older students much more than they'll listen to instructors, especially when it comes to just maintaining healthy habits and a good lifestyle. So my biggest point there is just find positive ways to mentor students. Mentorship is a big factor within learning and teaching culture policies.
Certainly, of course. The point that you mentioned about senior students being a great support in this one is actually the fact, and that really helps younger students to get better at working. Somebody from the Spark panel, I think Pratibha wanted to say something. Pratibha, you can go ahead.
There was the point about by the AIAS panel about overworking and it's relating to the time balance features now. And how much work is not overworking? Like we spend hours and hours for delivering the requirements asked for the submissions, and there are a set of deliverables given. And I also think if the deliverables can be flexible, that the design outputs which is enough to make the idea understandable and not producing so much which are more than enough. And marking the students based on each individual design and not as a comparative marking based on the amount of work produced. And I think that it needs to be practiced for not overworking and delivering the necessary output.
Thank you, Pratibha, for that. One of the things that we were talking about is the need for flexibility and variety in the studio. I think the React students, PSpark students also mentioned that, right? So my question to the AAS panelists is, was there any brief, an open-ended brief maybe, that there's a learning experience for you guys that you could share with, and how that resulted in a positive result that, that you could share with the other members? Maybe Sarah or Scott could maybe tell me about this. Or Cole.
No, yes, I apologize. My internet has been bad, so I was hoping someone else would answer first. Could you repeat the question really quickly?
Yeah, sure. So we were talking about, the PSpark students had mentioned about variety in briefs or open-ended briefs, right? So that would help them in coming up with more interesting solutions. Could one of you maybe share any of the experience that you had with, maybe an open-ended brief or flexibility in the design program that maybe helped you or had a positive impact on the learning and teaching itself?
Yes, I think that's a fantastic point to bring up, and something that can work really well with learning and teaching culture policies, which honestly hasn't been discussed very much on a national level. But designing and kind of, I mean, what Pratibha was talking about as well, grading work within schools of architecture doesn't work the same as other educational models. It's very subjective. It's not objective. It's not numeric. You can't say, they got this math problem correct, or they got this one wrong, or they did this process incorrectly. Everything's correct, or maybe everything's wrong. It's very subjective, and nobody knows. It's not prescriptive. So working in that openness into project briefs and into studio briefs is very important in terms of just teaching students how to design positively and can work into how to maintain that positive balance. So to be honest, I don't know that I can give any specific examples within my life of ways that has been practiced effectively, but I think it's a fantastic thing to note that we attempt to make architecture prescriptive because it's how we've been taught. I mean, through grade school, you're taught everything is prescriptive, everything has a right answer, and then you go into architecture school and suddenly nothing has a right answer. And a pretty common practice, at least within the US, is when you get into architecture school, that's explained to you and they say, there's no right answer, this is how design works. But then in terms of how they grade, how they create project briefs, none of that is in line with what they just told you. It all seems prescriptive and like there's a correct answer, and they're pushing you toward a certain point that you can't really find because, again, you're maybe on a completely different road than they are. But beginning to work that openness into projects and not being so prescriptive and still fitting within, of course, code and all the things that are in architecture that are technical is very important and something that could change culture within schools of architecture significantly on a level we haven't seen before. So I think that's a fantastic point to bring up. But sad to say, no, I don't have any personal experience with that.
Thank you for that.
Scott, that's a very interesting point. I still remember my first stint as teacher. I started my career as a teaching research fellow. Just graduated and became a teacher without any teaching experience. So I taught the first years the basic design, and I found it very difficult to judge them, or found it very difficult to evaluate the design. And those days we had the Council of Architecture coming for inspection, and we had these elite members, one of the top architects in India came to inspect the class, and we had displayed all the drawings which my studio did. And they were so stunned, the amount of work the first years have done. Loads and loads of work. They went to all the senior classes and they found probably nothing. They came to my studio and they found a whole lot of colorful stuff all over the walls, all over the panels. And one of those guys, Ranjit Sabiki, is still there. And this guy, he asked me, a very eminent architect, Sabiki, he asked me one question. He said, young man, can you This is about 35, 40 years back, okay? So young man, can you tell me how do you mark them or evaluate them? I was actually stunned. I just told him, I don't know. I don't know how to evaluate them. And that is something which is still deep into me. Even today, if I go for a review, I'm a very bad evaluator. And people don't want me to come there. You know why? Because I'm a very bad evaluator. I mean, everything looks good for me. Everything looks so fantastic for me. I mean, this is evaluation is, like you said, having a brief which is very open-ended. But I think at the end of the day, the evaluation becomes so tough and so complicated because it's very difficult to, when you do evaluation, it is a comparison made from one apple to another apple to apple comparison. So for an evaluation, for a teacher, when you're working on a university structure, at the end of the day, the grades really, what the transcript matters a lot because you have to pass the course or whatever it is. But it's so difficult. I don't know how your learning LTCP policy, whatever it is, how this is going to be resolved. But evaluation is a major criteria that needs to be really resolved in a longer way. So it's very difficult to evaluate.
Thank you.
Perfect.
We have a next question. This is addressed to Colt. It says, Tadano believes architecture cannot be taught in the studio. If so, how generic spaces can integrate to create a greater learning experience? Colt, can I have you on that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. You'll probably hear me say this a lot. Scott and Sarah have heard me say this quite a bit. I think it's sort of this empathy, this shared understanding. I think the space that we're in right now has become studio for a lot of us. We're no longer in our studio building. I think a lot of it is about mindset and sort of empathy about the way we approach the design and the design process. Architecture is difficult to understand and difficult to evaluate, but I think at the end of the day, we're all striving for very similar things, and that's sort of healthy architecture that's positively impacting people. So I really think it's about generating mindset, getting in the correct mindset as we approach sort of design problems and the design process. If I'm going into it with a negative headspace or without this sort of positive environment to support, whether it be peers on the screen or my peer at the desk next to me, it's not going to be a sort of productive or conducive environment to design or to iterate. And I think a lot of us have probably started to understand that over the last year now. And sort of, we can probably see from March of 2020 to April of 2021, how we've sort of changed our design mindset and how we approach virtual schooling or in-person schooling or whatever it may be. And I think a lot of it is about that empathy as we approach this process together and making sure that we're in the correct sort of mindset and sort of trying to project that into our design.
Yeah, and I really do, I know it was for Colt, but I really do want to go off of what you just said, Colt, the empathy aspect. And what I learned from the second presentation about, experiencing a space that wasn't conducive to design and then working to understand why this next space is better, what makes it more conducive to design. We might be in virtual spaces, we might, be traveling, we might, be in different situations or, maybe not in architecture, but the forced empathy that we've experienced this past year has to be worth something. We have to learn something from it. We have to become empathetic designers and think of the people who are going to be using spaces and take the knowledge that we've gained from the past year, really understanding the impact of space and how it impacts how we do work, how we interact with people. That has to be worth something within how we actually design. So I know that's already happening at the school, thinking through the school's actual design, which I love how integrated this experience sounds for everyone involved, and taking that same mindset to our virtual or any other spaces that we're experiencing, and then recreating in the future as designers. It's a lot of responsibility. design is hard to understand. Architecture is so hard to understand. I had to go back to, I'm going to stop talking after this, but the idea that the way architecture is often taught is showing precedence of showing this is good design, this is good design, this is good design, but maybe having a more difficult time identifying what makes that good design. And so that is also what makes critiques really challenging, is if you're only saying this is good because it is like this other project rather than the fundamentals of what makes that good design. And that's where our instructors have large tasks at hand to try to finesse what is the basis of good design. And there's whole branches of philosophy around what is beauty, right? So we're also trying to integrate that into our design, plus actual structural understandings and people, sociology, psychology, the last standing generalists of the profession of architecture. We have to do it all at once.
That's true. That's absolutely true. So there is a question for Scott here. Insane little bubble of non-reality is how a studio was described as. Has this changed in the last decade or so in the US? If so, how your experience can help transform our learning culture here? So this was Scott.
I love that. That was fantastic. And yes, I can definitely see the comparison to an insane bubble of non-reality. I would like to say that, yes, it is changing. I don't think it's changed as much as any of us have wanted or would like. But in terms of just the differences between architectural education in the US today and 20 years ago, 30 years ago, they were really wrapped up within their own bubble, not just within how they teach architecture, but within the culture of the studio and who's included in the studio and who's allowed to speak. Those kind of ideas all contributed to this bubble and this barrier between architects and reality. And today, I think we're starting to move into this place where we can connect to reality more. And we're talking about, how does this architecture fit into a global scale? How does it fit into our communities? How can we as architects go out into the communities and talk to people about what they want and we call them citizen architects. And I think that's a fantastic idea. And it's something, honestly, we're just starting to dip our toes into the water with, but it's starting to break down that barrier between, these high-minded, godlike architects that see themselves as the single architect that creates all these beautiful things and does it alone and is a lone wolf. And when we're trying to break that down and get into this idea of architecture is a team effort, and you have to work with others and get along with others, even people that aren't architects. You have to get along with people who have the money to build the building, people who are going to be putting the structure into the building. So starting to get those interdisciplinary aspects within architecture begins to break down those barriers, and also just reframing your mindset to, we're not here as architects to honestly, this might be a kind of a hot take, but we're not here as architects to create something beautiful. We're here as architects to create something for a community and something that's going to help people live better lives. So I've seen a shift start to happen, and especially the people who are focused on learning and teaching culture and making that shift are focused as well on pushing back into reality and pushing architecture back into the world. So yes, I do think it's starting to make a difference. I wish it would go faster, but these are institutions that have been around for hundreds of years, and it's going to be a slow change. But I'm excited for the direction we're moving in. So definitely.
Does anybody? Sorry, Sarah. Please go ahead.
Oh no, yeah. I'm so sorry. I keep doing this. I love to talk. Can you tell? A huge change in our culture that I have to note in the past 20, 30 years is also women in architecture. 30 years ago, you would not have seen the same number of women in architecture schools. So that's a huge culture shift that definitely is still in progress, and we need to do better, because it's not just women who should be included. It is our students of color, it is our faculty of color, and trying to be more culturally diverse in our studios as well is something that we have a lot of work to do on.
As we are on the point that Scott mentioned, the interaction of how architecture that it has with the neighborhood or the community that we design for. Does anybody from the final years of VSpark want to have a say on that? They are all doing their thesis, which is their capstone project. So if Kaustubh or somebody wants to I would say Costa particularly as doing an urban scale project for his thesis. Just a couple of words, Costa.
Sure. So absolutely, there's no disagreement to what Scott mentioned, or there's not even another like chain of thought that comes in, right? This is not debatable. Uh, so sort of going back to what we were also talking about in terms of variety that one needs to have in a studio, right? Uh, and also the way Khadija was talking about the design of a studio or the furniture's arrangement in a studio, and how at the studio level that idea of interaction within a smaller community can start. That's sort of like a precursor to students starting to move out into the communities and engaging with them. Also, again, going back to something we discussed in the presentation about how students learn from each other and students learn from batches across the entire school. That entire idea also could reinforce this entire idea of collaborating with the community on a larger scale. So I think it sort of all ties together in the same chain of thought, right? So it all starts in a studio and within the curriculum of the architecture school, perhaps, and that would help extension of these ideas into the profession and into the communities tomorrow.
Thank you, Gaurav. My question to all three AIS panelists here. So this, I think, would benefit all the younger students who are in their maybe first, second, third year participants here. So what do you think is the biggest myth that architecture community or us have been propagating, maybe knowingly or unknowingly, right? So which is something which we have to do something about, and the learning and teaching culture policy has to address.
I can go first because I love to talk. Knowingly or unknowingly, and it has been both in our history, especially in the United States, is racist architecture. Spaces that are not made for everyone and are exclusive to certain people. And there's so many ways that this happens. And I don't need to enumerate all of them, and many of you already know what they are, but challenging our own bias in design. And from your very first years in studio, that can be really challenging to do when you're just trying to learn how to design. And there's this flood of information that you have to consume so quickly, but feel free to challenge your instructors, ask questions about those aspects that you don't understand. Why is this valuable in architecture? What purpose does this serve? In everything, question everything. That way you have a better understanding of what practices you're perpetuating and who that impacts.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. And I just want to say, to me, I think it's sort of the idea of the complacent architect, the architect that just designs to design. I think at least Scott mentioned the idea of the citizen architect. I think personally, I'm not speaking to anyone who's come before me or who will come after me or any of us, but this idea that the architect doesn't have a space like in the political sphere and the improvement of people's lives directly, I think has been sort of perpetuated, at least through what I've been taught, is that you're here to design your building, you're here to get in, get out, you're here to just do that. And not really to acknowledge or think about the way that it impacts the community or the individual. And so I think the idea and the power that the architect has, both in the community and the potential political sphere and all these different aspects, and how much of a positive impact that can be and how much change we can do as designers.
Yes, fantastic answers, both of you. And I just will plus one all of that. I'll say the myth that I think has been perpetuated for the past, 100 years, maybe more, is that the architect is that lone wolf figure and that godlike designer that's all by him or herself and is designing these beautiful things, essentially for him or herself, which ties into what Sarah is saying. You're not designing for architects. You're not designing for yourself. You're designing for communities. So like, it's funny to think about people like, Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, Frank Gehry. These are not people who are operating independently. They like to make it seem like they are. they like to make it seem like they're designing everything alone, but there's hundreds and hundreds of people that worked under all three of them and all these famous architects. I don't know if the book The Fountainhead is popular in India, but it's a fantastic representation of just the mindset of architects for the past 100 years, how they've seen themselves, their perception of themselves. So if you haven't read that, I would encourage you to read that book, not as an example of how you should be as an architect, but as an example of how you should not be, and to see how far we've come and how architecture has changed, and see that architecture is a community effort and not a design effort. And I like what Colt said about the power that architects have, because architects have always perceived themselves as powerful, but just in a different way than they should have. They've perceived themselves as powerful in terms of design and creation and being, again, this godlike figure. And we are powerful, but not in that way. We're powerful in terms of changing the community and engaging with people and giving them something that will benefit their lives. So yeah, I shouldn't be plugging The Fountainhead, but if you haven't read it, I would love for you all to read it, just to see, don't do this, don't be like this, make a change from this.
Thank you, all of you. And I think, Scott, I can go on to safely say that Fountainhead has done the same damage to India as it has done to any other part of the world. Thank you, all three. And my last question, we're running out of time. So my last question is sort of looking at it from the teacher's perspective. I think Sarah also mentioned how this is not targeting teachers who are the other end of the spectrum. So I think on to that, so what do you think the role of a teacher is in advocating the learning and teaching culture policy, especially in the Indian context? I would request Dr. Jaffer or Dr. Michael to take this question on from the teacher's perspective.
I think Michael should talk about it. Michael, are you okay? Or
yeah, I'm fine. I'm really healthy, actually. I'm really healthy, but overheated right now. 35 degrees in my cabin here. Learning how to deal with the heat. I'm in a mix. So I'm just going to preface this a little bit. I'm a mixture. I'm a Canadian. I'm a registered licensed architect in New York State. I have a master's from Vienna. I've worked in India teaching for 4 years, and I've been coming to India for a lot of years. So I'm really a mixed person in terms of my experiences and my views on all of this, and especially on teaching. The Indian context is a very special one. It touches a lot of things that you deal with in North America. But you have to think that, for example, India was, you could say, traumatized by the British. And rather than the indigenous people being a minority, it's the totality. And the influence is powerful. The schooling is rigid, difficult, old school. And my little experience here, I don't know the past, but I know that the teaching in architecture has emerged from a very rigid, like stick across the fingers kind of attitude, and is very, very open now comparatively, and moving in that direction very quickly. The teaching here is foundation is Western, right? You just imagine that. Like, why would it be Western with 1.3 billion people? So there's a real issue here in terms of where the teaching is going to go. I mean, I would say we're at square zero. My own opinion. I know that other people might not agree with me, but I think that Indian education in architecture is, I would say, it's square zero, because really there's such a legacy, such a cultural, profound legacy here, which goes back thousands of years, and it's not being taught at all. It's just not. It's not here. So I think there's going to be a big change as people, and there is that movement is already happening, but there's a schism between the people who teach, traditional architectural styles. They have their own school, their own registration, and everything. There's a schism. And, so I come from, I really enjoyed my architectural education. I came out of University of Oregon healthy. I came out of Columbia University with 2 months of illness and a broken arm. It was really hard. Mentally, that's how you don't make it. The only way you don't make it out of those schools is by collapsing mentally. They don't fail you. If you make it through, you're good to go. I don't know how it is now. I graduated about 25 years, no, 30 years ago from there. So it was brutal, right? Just brutal. And I'm guessing that people are fighting against that. It's not that brutal here because there's a natural tendency to be relaxed in a way that we don't see in some places. But I don't know how relaxed people really feel. As a young person, I might have looked relaxed outside, but maybe I didn't feel relaxed at all. I didn't. I felt very stressed. So I think that's all I would like to do is to just give a kind of a contextual view of it, as a member of the AIA and looking from that side and seeing what I've been embedded in here for almost 4 years now, teaching in India, that actually there's a whole movement that is probably just still like a seed under the ground. It hasn't even really sprouted yet, in my opinion, of a reevaluation and what would you call it? A refacilitation of things and values that everybody here believes in, but there's no real way to be active in that way. And the teaching of architecture doesn't support it whatsoever. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. As far as I can understand, I think the relationship between the teacher and the student is like a dollar. A dollar has prints on both sides, and if you have no print on one side, if the dollar is blank, and it becomes useless. So the knowledge can only spread with mutual understanding and mutual respect. More than anything else, the mutual responsibility. I think the students as well as the teachers have to have basically responsible in what they deliver in terms of knowledge, and what they have to be responsible in terms of expressing that knowledge when they go out of the school. But most important for being responsible is discipline. And I think it's not discipline being regimental. Discipline doesn't mean regimental. Discipline which can make you learn things in reality. And that is the most important part of it. But before I could end, I want to ask a question for my own student, Kaustubh. The question is, Kaustubh, I want you to tell me how you'd like to have a studio. If you were a designer and you want to design a studio, architecture studio, what would you do?
That's a tough one. I would take some time to answer that, but if you put me on the spot like that, I think I'll have to say that the first thing one would have to look at is the physical space of it. So in our previous discussions as a class or as a panel, we've been thinking about what happens if a studio is not designed completely like a studio. Why do we have to design it in a way that there are 4 boxes, and then in this box you're supposed to do this, in that box you're supposed to do that, and then the other 2 boxes are meant for some other activities. So I would instead design a studio which is more open for interpretation physically by a student. But that's just the physical part of it, sir. I think what's really important is what happens within the physical space of that studio. More than the design of it, I think how we utilize it, how we use it, how it's really structured. Like Aarti spoke about, accommodating process and accommodating variety, or accommodating like the individuality of every single student. That's important, more than just the design of a studio. I think that would be my response to that question. So,
okay, Kaustubh, I have a project for you. Okay, when you finish your capstone project thesis, I want you to make a team of your batch and start working on a studio proposal at WeSpark. Okay. So I will give you a studio space and you will retrofit the studio space to suit the policies which you feel is going to be student oriented. All right. And this is my promise. I'll get the management to redo a typical studio, and that policy we can try and experiment with our students. So that is your first project, practical project, and we won't take the work free of cost. We'll pay you for that. So this is a project which I'm giving you right in front of the IAS team, and you have to collaborate with Scott and all some of your young members of AIAS to see that best of the studio is created in VSpark. All right, and that's your first project.
Thanks a lot, sir. We'll stay in touch then, Scott and Colt. Let's keep the discussion going and see how that would be done. Right? Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all the panelists and all our audiences for participating and sending in your questions. I think I would like to thank all the AS members specifically for all their time and helping us with all these answers. So I think I'd move on to Professor Dinesh Raghavan, who will be proposing the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, the AS team and VSpark members. Right now, we'll be closing this panel discussion. So let's have a closing comments by each of the member. Let me start with the AIS members. Maybe I'll start with Sarah. The closing comments.
Absolutely, and I get to speak more, so I will be very brief and just say thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you so much for opening this conversation at your school. It's actually really inspiring to see the work that you're doing and to see the full commitment of the school as well as the students into these types of conversations. So thank you so much for inviting us.
Scott, yeah.
Yeah. I don't have much to say either. I'm in awe by your work today and by the discussion that you've had. The presentation you all put together was fantastic. And to be totally honest with you, on a level of understanding about studio culture and learning and teaching culture that you rarely see at any school, even within the US, and even within schools that are involved in AIS very deeply. So I'm really excited for where you all will go from here. And I'd love to be a part of it. So, keep in contact with us, keep in touch, and I'd love to. Dr. Khan mentioned at the beginning that I could visit if I wanted to, and I'd love to visit sometime. I'll try to get out there, and that would be fantastic. But yeah, I'm very excited.
You take your flight tomorrow if you can.
Okay, deal. I'll be there. But yes, I'm very excited for just getting your help and pushing our policies forward as well. I know we presented the learning and teaching culture policy project and all of that, but these are by no means finished or complete. And I'm excited for including you all as contributors to future efforts, because I think you're very knowledgeable and in a very good place to make great change. So thank you for inviting us. Incredible conversation.
And then I guess it's me. Yeah, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for having us. Coming into this, didn't know what to expect, but just want to say y'all's presentation was fantastic. Y'all are obviously in a fantastic spot as a school, and I'm so excited to see where y'all are able to take this. It feels like y'all taught us a lot of things today, which is fantastic, which we really appreciate. And I just want to say, yeah, looking forward to hearing from most of you, if not all of you. And yeah, I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation. And yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you. Yeah, followed by the VSpark members. Maybe Kaustubh, stand.
Right. So it's just been weeks and weeks of planning this event. So I'd like to first off congratulate Priyani and the entire team for pulling off this entire event. And also I'd like to thank Priyani and Sarah for really coordinating and bringing this whole group together for this discussion. So I'd like to go back to something that Sarah had mentioned that sort of stuck on throughout the course of the discussion, right? So the policy doesn't have to really be something that's stuck on a wall per se. So it's something that you should start living off of in the entire studio. So with that, I'd like to just invite our entire group of students to keep thinking about what you'd like to happen and where would you like to go from here, because these were just mere facts that came up during our set of discussions as a group of 5, and we tried to mix it up a little bit, get students from different batches going. But then what really happens tomorrow is up to the entire community of students. So instead of just giving a comment, I'd like to extend this opportunity to all our students to keep thinking about this, and also keep interacting with your mentors and keep interacting with your teachers. And we've got nowhere but up to go from here. So I think it should be a good start. This event was a good start.
Yeah. About other members, please go ahead.
I just first of all like to congratulate the whole team for putting this together, because we know how much work has been going into it, and it's been such a fruitful discussion. And I don't really have leaving like a comment to leave as such, but it's more along the lines of how this discussion has opened up so many perspectives that require more thought and require us to articulate a lot of things way better. So I do hope that such a discussion does let us pave way to, establishing a more better learning as well as teaching culture at VSPAC, which can also be like an example that can be used for the rest of the colleges as well.
So yeah, for me, this discussion is allowing to talk about many things that which, as a student personally, I have always feared and complaining with peers about and never talking it openly. Now this is so liberating that we have talked about a lot of things. Thank you.
I'm glad that we had this conversation and that we've been given so much of so many new outlooks towards learning and teaching culture. And again, like how Sarah mentioned, these policies are living documents. I'm hoping we draft these policies and have a fruitful future. Thank you.
So I think this was a really great opportunity for all of us to learn so much about this topic, not just for us panelists, but also for the audience. And I'm really excited to see how this goes on into the future and helps all of us learn better.
Yeah, thank you, the AIS members and VSPAC members, and also our moderators, Architect Deepika and also Professor Deepika from VSPAC. And this panel discussion on studio culture given a lot of insights and lots to hear from this young minds about talking about studio culture, how the studio should be, and how the studio document, create a good document for the studio culture. It was a wonderful discussion, and thank you all for being here. And over to Priyani.
Thank you, sir. I know we have reached the official end time, but I hope no one minds a few more minutes here, because these have been such great conversations and such exciting ideas. So moving ahead, I would now invite Sarah, the AIAS National Vice President for the year 2020-21, to kindly make the special announcement of this event.
Yes, and I apologize that this is not full screen. My computer just won't get into it, but very briefly, just want to again say thank you and give a quick overview of what the AIS is, because you'll see why. So the AIS is an independent nonprofit student-run organization. We're very proud of all these aspects of the AIS. And we do, this is what we do. This is our mission statement, and we advance leadership, design, and service among architecture students, clearly very in line with the conversations that we've been having today. And why do we do all this work? This is our vision statement, is to empower voices, ideas, and actions for the future. And how do we do this? All the big questions. We have 6 value statements of community, growth, impact, passion, perspective, and balance. Again, very relevant to the conversations we've been having today. And I officially want to congratulate VSPARC for their soft launch of their AIS chapter. This is the first AIS chapter in India, and an absolute huge round of applause for the incredible work that has been done by the ad hoc committee to start this chapter and to create some really amazing precedents. I know they have really fantastic big goals for the chapter and the work that's going to be done, especially around learning and teaching culture. So an absolute huge round of applause for this team congratulations for embarking on establishing the very first AIS chapter in India. And that is a big announcement. Thank you all so much for taking part in this process.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's been a pleasure to work with you to bring this discussion and this event to fruition. And we at VSpark look forward to what look like a very exciting next few months to establish this chapter and continue the work of AIAS forward. And Scott is here, so congratulations on your election as the next national president. So I know we will be in touch, and we look forward to working with you. And now if I could invite Dr. Jaffer to please share a few words with us, because this would not have been possible without your guidance, your support, and your encouragement.
Oh, thank you, Priyani. And I first of all must congratulate the VSpark student team for having shown that extraordinary leadership and organizing this event, and so meticulously planning and timing this and working out through it, and your wonderful presentation. And I have big hope that AIS chapter will do a lot of good to the school and to the future students, future generation of students who will be part of VSpark. Wonderful initiative, wonderful piece of work for the past 2 months, and then we'll continue to try to establish this further, and we will be in closer connection with EIAS USA, and we will definitely show the way to the student community in India. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. So now with this, we are at the end of this very, very energized event. And I would like to invite Sneha S to please deliver the vote of thanks.
So, hello everyone. It's an honor to present the event closure on behalf of VSpark. Firstly, I'd like to start by congratulating everyone present here for making this event productive and successful. There are a network of people that I would like to acknowledge and credit for today's panel discussion. First and foremost, I convey my heartfelt gratitude to our panelists from AIAS, Colt, Scott, and Sarah for giving us their vital time and knowledge on the subject of learning and teaching culture. Your explanations on the 9 values associated with the learning and teaching culture policy has been inspiring and has given us the direction to establish our own very policy. We look forward to learning and collaborating more with you in the future. I extend my congratulations and thanks to our student panelists, Aarti, Kaustubh, Pratibha, Jabin, Khadija, whom with their effort, zest, and initiative have made the discussion lively and successful. It is important to also credit Vishruta from 4th year, who has played a key role in assisting with the wonderful presentation we saw earlier. Next, the director of our school, Dr. Jafar A.A. Khan, who has been instrumental in providing us with this wonderful opportunity to explore the thought-provoking idea of studio culture. For that, I thank you. I convey my heartfelt thanks to you, sir. A special thanks to Dr. Michael Karasovich and Professor Deepika for their endless support, guidance, and assistance in making this event a possibility. I thank architect Deepika Varatharajan for the capable way in which she has moderated the event along with Professor Deepika. I also extend my thanks to our faculty coordinator, Professor Dinesh Raghavan, and our faculty members for their insight and support. I'm grateful to all students and other participants for the continuous cooperation and exuberance for this event. I can't finish without crediting the members of the DARAP committee who have worked side by side to see the completion of the event, and VIT management for giving us this opportunity. I end by once again thanking everyone present here for taking their time to listen to a panel discussion on studio culture. Despite time differences, we have gathered here and listened to excellent addresses given by our panelists, which I believe speaks for the intent and goal of the event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules. And yes, I hope we continue this conversation. I hope everyone has a good weekend. I mean, we at India are towards night, but Sarah, Colt, and Scott have the rest of the day and the rest of the weekend.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you
all.
Thank you all.